All right, guys, we're back and we're now actually into the Civil War and everything. And the first battle is going to be called Bull Run. One thing you're going to have to know is a lot of the Civil War battles actually have two names. And you'll get used to hearing things like Sharpsburg, Antietam, same battle. Manassas, Bull Run, same battle. Chickamauga, Chattanooga. There's all these battles that have two different names. The reason that comes from is the North always named the battle after the town. So, like the Battle of Antietam is going to happen right next to Sharpsburg town, and so the North is going to record it as the Battle of Sharpsburg. The South, because it's right next to Antietam Creek, will record it as the Battle of Antietam. And so, a lot of times with the Civil War, it does get confusing because which name are we going by? But most people refer to this as the Battle of Bull Run. Right there outside of Washington, D.C. is a little town called Manassas. I've drove right by before, went right by this battlefield, have not stopped, always wanted to. There's a little stream called Bull Run. And so what happens is the South has got an army together. They're starting to get there, and they are staying in the South right now. They're trying to defend their own country. And the North is having all its troops assemble in Washington, D.C. They keep showing up there. They're getting more. They're practicing. They're drilling. And finally, they decide they are going to invade and go take on the South. Most people at this time thought because that the North had a military, they had soldiers already trained. The South is training its soldiers, other than the people that left that were already soldiers. Most people thought that the Civil War was going to be one battle. They were going to go out there. The North would show the South that they need to stay in line. The South would say, "I'm sorry," and it'd go right back to being like it was. So when the North decides they're going to go invade and go take on the South, there is actually massive amounts of people that go with them. People get into carriages, into wagons. They pack picnics. They get out to the town of Manassas. The people start to set up picnics all around it because they think, oh, we got an afternoon. Let's watch this thing called the Civil War because it'll be over by tonight. It is not going to be that way at all. What happens is the North does bring in a lot of troops and everything. But remember what I said, the South's biggest advantage is military leadership. So what happens at this battle is, like I say, the North goes out there. You got a lot of people come out to picnic. Here is the stream Bull Run right there. You can see this is an old photo of that time. Here is a reenactment photo of the battle out there. You can see in the back the crowds that come out to watch, and they'll line up and show you this. But at the first Battle of Bull Run, what happens is the North comes marching in, and they decide to pinch them from the side. And so they start to come around that way. The problem being that is where a man by the name of Stonewall Jackson is. And he is there with all his North Carolina troops. What happens, the North starts to swing around. They start to come up the hill. Immediately, the Southern troops, they try and hold on for a minute, but immediately they start to fall back, and they go up the hill. The North now is at the bottom of the hill marching up. They're going to be chasing the South backwards. And at this moment in history is when Stonewall Jackson gets his name. They're at the bottom of the hill, they're coming up, and all of a sudden to the top of the hill comes this one horse riding by itself, and it stops at the crest of this hill. And on it is Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, and he stands there on his horse, and as the North is advancing up the hills, he just stands there with his horse trotting and everything, but his horse is doing all this stuff, and he's standing there, and the bullets are whizzing by him left and right. And he's trying to get his soldiers to come back up and fight with him. And that's when people looked over and said, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. And after that, he's going to be called Stonewall Jackson all his life, which isn't going to go that much longer. It only goes till 1863. But he's going to be Stonewall Jackson after that. The other thing that's interesting about this, remember I said history is all around you. It's everywhere you're at. The guys from North Carolina, they ran back to the top of the hill. They anchored down, and as the North kept coming up, they kept shooting and destroying, and the North would go back down the hill, and they would try and come back up, and the South would repel them back down the hill. And that's when Lee looked over at the North Carolina troops that were with General Jackson and said, those guys are standing on that hill like there's tar stuck on their heels. And after that, North Carolina took on the nickname of Tar Heels. In fact, the University of North Carolina, their mascot is the Tar Heel, and it comes from the first battle of Bull Run. But as the North kept trying to come up the hill, finally they had like 3 charges up, haven't been able to make it. They're coming up with the 4th, and that's when Jackson tells his troops, and they go marching down the hill, and it sends the Northern troops running everywhere. Now you have total chaos breaking out because all these picnickers that are there, you're now having Army troops run through their picnic fields, shooting at each other, people dying right where you're trying to eat your ham sandwich. And so it turned into a chaos, and they said you could literally tell where the Army had been because you could follow all the stuff dropped all the way back to Washington, D.C., that these guys are running and just throwing their guns down. They're running and they didn't care. They were severely beaten. In the first battle, the South proved just military leadership alone was enough to prove this is not going to be a quick victory. This is not going to be over in just a matter of days. This is going to be some problems. So that is the Civil War now started. There is a little clay animation thing of it. I thought that was pretty cool, like there. Kara Peak is so good about putting all this stuff in there. All right, so it is now 1861. We're pretty much going through that battles, but by 1862, the North keeps getting beat and beat and beat and beat. 1861, that's the big battle that starts off, but you're going to see several times after that, the North would line up, and then all of a sudden it would just fall apart. The leadership was not there. McClellan is trying to lead them, and it is not working. So the Anaconda Plan, the first thing it was to do was to choke off the Atlantic Ocean. And if you remember that, I said Lincoln sends people out, they begin to choke off the Atlantic Ocean. But the next part of it is you're going to have to stop the Mississippi. So Lincoln gets this general who is the most unlikely of generals. He usually is unkempt. He's got a beard. He's messy. Most of the time, if you look at his photos, he's wearing a captain's uniform, even though he's a general. He just didn't want to change his clothes. He liked what he was wearing. He is an interesting man in himself. His name is Ulysses Simpson Grant. That ain't his name. His name is actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he went to West Point. And when he went to West Point, my kids know this, he did not want his initials on his shirt, which is what you're going to do. You're going to put 2 initials and then the last name on a shirt. He realized his initials, it's going to say Hug on his shirt. That is not the most manly way to hit West Point. And so at signing up, he thought the most American sounding name you could get was to have your first 2 initials be U.S. And in fact, his buddies and stuff are going to call him Uncle Sam because of that for a while until he gets the nickname Unconditional Surrender. But so he changes his name on the form and writes down Ulysses, his middle name. His mom's maiden name was Simpson. So he put his mom's maiden name down as the middle name and then Grant. So you have U.S. Grant. And he thought that was a cool nickname to have. Well, he is the general picked to be in charge of taking out the Mississippi River. And so the first thing that happens is he goes down the Tennessee River. There he is supposed to try and take a Fort Donelson right there at Nashville. Most of the war, because of this, Nashville is going to be in the hands of the Northern Army. So in 1862, Ulysses S. Grant, he starts down the Tennessee River. He's got to get to the Mississippi, but you got to bypass Nashville. There's a big fort there called Fort Donelson, but before that, there is a small little fort called Fort Henry. You could have bypassed right by, taken a couple shots, but you could have got by and got to Fort Donelson. But Ulysses S. Grant, he ends up stopping at Fort Henry, fighting and taking Fort Henry. And if you look at the Tennessee River, how it rolls and everything, after he takes Fort Henry, he sends half his troops by land out and around to come in behind Fort Donelson. And then what he does is he continues on down the river, brings his boats up in front. Where do you think all the Southerns are looking at? They're looking at the front. They all run to the fort. The front of the fort's being guarded, trying to watch for the boats. And that's the exact time that his guys come in from the back and start attacking the fort. At this fort, he gets the request that the other general looks at him and says, "What are the terms of surrender?" Meaning, okay, I get to keep my sword. Our guys get to go free. We get to go back. What are the terms of surrender? If we surrender, what are you going to do? And that's when Grant replied to the other general, "My conditions are this: unconditional." Meaning, you got no right. I'm going to beat you up and take you down. And you ain't got no right to ask for anything. My conditions are, you ain't got no conditions. And so after that, now once again, there's your initials playing into it, the U.S. After that, he is known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. That whole U.S. thing is playing in for him big time. It's helping out. So he ends up taking Nashville at Fort Donelson. He is then going to go on down the Tennessee River to where it runs into the Mississippi. You are still in the state of Tennessee, but he unloads there. He is trying to get to Mississippi. He's going to march across the land and come down on everybody like that, a place called Antioch. But as he unloads his guys there and everything, the Southern Army, who they thought was probably 30, 40 miles distance, had actually made it to right there. So they get off the boats, they're unloading, they start cooking breakfast and everything. And at that point, the South finds out that the North is in Shiloh, Tennessee, and the battle begins. The South immediately is attacking this one. They call this one area the Hornets Ridge because bullets were flying so fast back and forth. It sounded like hornets in the air. It was just constantly. It is a very bloody battle. But as they start to take the North and the North leaves and starts to flee back, the South, remember, once again, go back to the very beginning. Why did we go over all those things? The South has no resources. As the North fled and they left where they were and are driven back towards the river, the South could have pressed and won the battle right then. But as the South is coming through the northern camps, the North had been cooking breakfast at that time. And they can smell all the food cooking. And the Southern soldiers sat down and started eating the Northern soldiers' food. They were so hungry. So at this point then, Grant is able to back up, and he's all the way up against the swamps and then the river. He's able to hold it off till the swamps, till it's at night. At this point, General Beauregard, who is in charge, you got to say it that way, General Beauregard. It sounds very Southern. General Beauregard, all of a sudden, he, at that night, decides to send a letter to Jefferson Davis. And he sends a letter to Jefferson Davis saying how they've beaten Grant at Shiloh. Tomorrow they'll be doing the surrender, and sends all this information. They've won the battle because they literally do have Grant pinned up against the river, nowhere to go. Finish him off tomorrow. That evening, General Ulysses S. Grant is in his tents and everything, and his other people under him come on in, and they say, we're here to go ahead and start to draft up the surrender things. And Grant looked at him and says, no, you're here to set up the battle plans for tomorrow because we are going to meet the enemy and we're going to take them on tomorrow. Grant, even though he's beat completely right here, he's not thinking that. This is what the North needs, a general that is aggressive, a general that is smart, but a general that's going to do his job. And that night then, in the middle of the night, they get their battle plans ready. And that night, they had divided up the boats and everything. The other half of his boats show up with all these new fresh soldiers. They start unloading like at 3 o'clock in the morning. They unload all their soldiers into the swamp with them. And then at dawn, the North is able to push out of the swamp. And it is a huge victory for the North. Everybody is so excited about the fact that the North has finally got a victory. Now it's out west. We're still not winning in the East as a nation, but out west they finally have a victory. This leads to a weird thing with General Grant. General Grant, if you've ever seen a picture of him, he always has a cigar in his mouth. He didn't smoke before this battle. At this battle, when he wins, they put a cigar in his mouth, say, hey, here's a victory cigar, and they take a picture. He is the first general to be winning for the North. And so what happens is people are all excited and they start sending him gifts. Every day, 20, 30, 40 boxes of cigars are showing up because everybody thinks Grant smoked cigars because he had one in that picture. Grant is giving them to the soldiers. He can't give them away fast enough. He starts smoking them. By the end of the war, Grant was smoking 18 cigars a day. He is literally 24 hours. I mean, the whole time he's up, he's got a cigar in his mouth going boom, 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 right after each other. Grant is going to, by the end of the war, because smoking, one thing they don't tell you, is going across your taste buds and everything like that. And he burnt up all his taste buds and never could taste anything after the Civil War because of that victory at Shiloh, where he got that famous cigar picture. All right, there's a picture of the battle at Shiloh, a drawing and everything like that. On the river, there were some battles on the river between ironclads. You had the Monitor to the north and the Merrimack to the south. The Monitor, if you look at it and everything, it is a boat that was sunk. I'm sorry, the Monitor from the north. The Monitor is this picture you see down there where it's got the sloped up sides and it's got cannons mounted all down it. And if you look at it, it's made of metal on top. Underneath in the water is wood, but cannonballs aren't going to hit there, and the top is completely done over with metal. The South does one called the Merrimack, where they raise up a ship that had been sunk and put this on top of it. You got the wooden bottom, and on top theirs is flat with a round turret that has one cannon in it, and it can turn. They can crank this handle, and it can turn and fire wherever it needs to. These two big boats made of iron, this is the first time battleships are going to meet in battle. Two iron boats come up to each other out on the water, and they begin to pound each other with these cannonballs. Cannonballs were literally hitting the metal and bouncing off. And so the battle goes on for 3 hours. No one has ever seen anything like this before, where it's just one shot after another, and they're just bouncing off these boats. Eventually, the boats have to drift away. But this is the first time in history you're actually seeing a battleship, a boat that has been covered in iron. The interesting thing about this, I want you to get this, these are cannons inside of this, and it is a room completely wrapped in metal. The first shots were miserable. After that, didn't matter at all, because on the first shot, especially on the Merrimack, that round room, they said they fired the cannons the first time, and the loud boom inside a metal room going off, they said every one of the soldiers, bam, their earbuds exploded. They could not hear. Blood was dripping out their ears. None of them, they were all completely deaf. From that moment on, after the first shot, it was loud enough, it blew out their eardrums. And so the Monitor is dealing with lots of, it's a bigger room, but it's still just as miserable as the Southern soldiers. I mean, no eardrums after the first shot. So it was a very interesting battle and everything right there. David Farragut, you need to know this name, dealing with the water campaigns and on the rivers and everything. David, yes, that is exactly the Farragut from Farragut, Tennessee, up there in Knoxville. If you go up to Farragut, Tennessee, they have a football team. The local football team is called the Admirals. Why? You are looking, if you look at the picture right there, at Admiral David Farragut. Admiral David Farragut, and he is not an admiral when he joins the Navy. He joins the Navy at age 9 during the War of 1812. He was so fierce, so vicious when they would tack boats that he would get on there and start fighting, manning cannons, doing everything he needed to do. By age 12, he was put in charge as captain of one of the captured ships. He is the one who leads the blockade of all the southern ports. There is one famous one he's famous for, was Fort Morgan. Fort Morgan is down there in Florida. And if you look at it, you got to go by this little ravine, this little area, and the fort is right there. And right as you go through that little inlet, they had put torpedoes on either side, and they were launching these torpedoes into the water. And Fort Morgan's untouchable because you can't get to it because all those torpedoes will take you down before you get there. When David Farragut showed up with his ships and they saw Fort Morgan, they said, it's untouchable. You can't get there because of the torpedoes. That is a famous line. David Farragut says, I won't say the word, blank the torpedoes, and just takes his ships and goes straight towards Fort Morgan. Ships are being shot with these torpedoes, but his guys go straight through that and get to the other side and take Fort Morgan. Then after they take Fort Morgan, he takes 46 ships. He goes and he surrounds the port of New Orleans. And you're not going to be getting anything coming in and out. And New Orleans will surrender. He is famous for his capture of New Orleans and a famous phrase from his capture at Fort Morgan. So I'm going to stop right there, and then we are going to jump into the last couple battles for this week.